Good morning, everyone, and welcome to IDC. I welcome you all on behalf of the faculty and staff members of the institute. We have gathered here for the roundtable, that is evidence-based research, potential and challenges of randomized controlled trials, RCT. The special focus of the roundtable is also on the work of the Noble Laureate Professor Abhijit Banerjee's RCT technique. So welcome all of you. I request Dr. Pramod Kumar to give his welcome address.
Friends, the today's topic of discussion is relevant to many of the people who are present in this audience and otherwise also, to discuss the various methods through which you pursue, you indulge yourself in the pursuit of knowledge. And since one is at one level concerned also that most of the research in social sciences and in economics in this part of the country has taken a backseat. Not many people are involving themselves in extensive and intensive research. But my basic concern is three things. Number one, that this increasing trend which is there and which is based on evidence-based research, this phrase we use very frequently in our conversations. And this evidence-based research, of which one of the method is randomized controlled trials. And this methodology, they will explain, has been borrowed from medical sciences. And this is used for making developmental policies. The evidence-based data provide insight into the policy formulation. The facts thus generated do not speak for themselves. It depends which facts are selected to hinge arguments and propositions. So basic point I am trying to make, that the selection of facts is basically for formulation of policy is a function of politics. So policy is nothing else but politics. You may give number of evidences, but which evidence the policy will hinge its programs on depends upon the kind of politics which is being pursued at that level. So evidence research is at one level, the selection of those facts is the domain of politics for policy formulation. Choosing a policy is a politics. Which kind of politics you want to exercise, you choose that kind of policy and that kind of evidences you will use for your making the policy. I also remember one very interesting incident. There was lots of debate, that tribals don't have the houses. In Madhya Pradesh, they built number of houses for the tribals. After 1 year they found tribals were not living in those houses, the buffaloes were living. And tribals were sleeping outside the houses. So the evidence was they need a house. So it was given the house to them, but they were not living in those houses. Because from multiplicity of causes, you chose only one cause. So the need was to give buffaloes also a space where they can be covered space, then can be house, because buffalo is their main asset. They wanted to protect their asset to have a livelihood. So you didn't go into the various kind of causes and build a hierarchy of the causes. So multiplicity of causes without building the hierarchy, for which purpose, to achieve which value, you want to implement certain evidences based research, which you didn't do that. Again, that's the function of policy. So in evidence based multi-causality approach, the event, incident, activity are investigated in isolation. Isolate the event, incident, activity and insulate the system. That is the ultimate result. The situation changes, the context varies, needs multiply, and policy based on evidence give their judgments in favor of a program which doesn't change the structure or the structural boundaries which exist, which make that phenomena continuously reoccur at different times. So it should be emphasized that problem-centered research is encouraged by the grant-giving agencies. For instance, in RCT case, it is the World Bank. So basically, it's a spin. What kind of spin you give is a choice with the politics, and therefore, problem-centered research, evidence-based research must have a theory to back and also have hierarchy of causation, and which should be prioritized as per the policy and the politics which they want to pursue. And therefore, I think that somewhere you say that my research doesn't have any politics, my research doesn't have any value attached, then you are only hoodwinking people. You are not trying to tell the true story that your research also is a research which has a value attached to it, which has a politics, which is definitely built into it, and therefore the need is to see through that what kind of prescription it will give.
One part which you have covered very well, which is what I wanted to speak, was the interface between politics and economics. And that's something that one should keep in mind. The limitations of the discipline itself, the limitations of the science itself, and how it is. At least those who are involved in policy making, they would know it much better as to policies are not based just on evidence or just on someone. It takes a huge number of years for any policy to materialize. Let me state some things right in the front. Up front, let me put it very clear. Evidence is necessary. There is no denial, and you cannot have an argument that evidence is bad. The question is, what kind of an evidence? And what is the validity of that evidence? And how should you treat that evidence that comes to you? Any government which is spending money or wants to do something would like to have some kind of an impact evaluation done. Methods may vary on those issues. And evidences again can be generated. There are dangers of not using evidence. One of the dangers is that if you simply go with belief system, then you may end up hurting much more than having some kind of scientific evidence in front of you. So if I have a choice between having a, say, imperfect evidence on one side and having no evidence at all, I would go for an imperfect evidence rather than go for no evidence at all. Look at the example, and this is my favorite example of it, demonetization. Logically, everybody agrees. There is black money in the system. People stash colored cash in their pillows or whatever, XYZ. A lot of these anecdotal stories that you know of. And if you actually go out just on the street before the demonetization happened, now the opinions may be divided, and asked that what if I do something like this? That fellow will say the same thing. Ban all cash. Because they all know that, and this is something which is there. But again, that is not evidence. But certainly, if you are going to do something as dramatic as demonetization or something as dramatic as GST, or are going to do something which may have long-term impact on the health of your economy, you need to have evidence rather than simply go on the gut feeling of it. And that evidence is something which is where the RCTs at least are to be recognized, that they have generated some evidence. Yes, their methods may have a problem. Their approach is problematic, and that is what we are going to discuss. And everything that Professor Pritam said, Dr. Kumar said, all of that was perfectly valid. I mean, evidence is only one feedback into policy. Only one. Out of, say, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe millions. So therefore, when we talk about a control group versus a treatment group, there is never ever a control group which is exactly the same as a treatment group. So that's something which is impossible to, even with the most, I mean, say for example, even if you try and kind of use 10 different variables to find out that, so the age composition is the same, sex composition is the same, everything is the same, even then, the control group will rarely be the same as the treatment group. And therefore, that kind of getting a perfect control group is very, very difficult. And those are technical issues. And the third issue on methodology is the causation versus correlation theory, which is an old issue. So although it is couched in a language which says that it is far more rigorous and robust, it actually is much weaker than the traditional way of looking at, deriving at a kind of an estimate on what causes what. And it's also simply because the causation can be direct causation, it can also be indirect causation. It can depend. Sometimes it's very difficult to figure it out. With most scientific studies also, you may have a problem of causation. So really the problem that comes with is the approach, what we call as the whole approach of the randomized control trials, which is what was pointed out by you and by Pritam seconded in that sense, is that it is kind of trying to break down an issue into micro issues. And that is where the problem becomes much more important. Remember, the Nobel Prize Committee gave it for experimental approach to poverty alleviation. Had it been only for the experimental approach to problem solving, I wouldn't have a problem. When you say experimental approach to poverty alleviation, that is something which is a problematic issue, because poverty alleviation is something which requires a good understanding of what poverty is. So two people who are equal in all terms, equally educated, equal in terms of income, equal in terms of everything else, would still face discrimination. A good example of that is women. That is happening in Harvard, which still doesn't have a single black professor, or it can be in LSE, which still doesn't have a single black professor, or it could be a Dalit not being there in any of the big universities here. So, in our cases, poverty or deprivation or discrimination are interlinked. They are not clearly identifiable. You cannot say that here is where deprivation ends, discrimination begins, and then again, that is not something which is, and they all overlap. People are poor not because they choose to be poor, they are poor because the system has made them poor. That part is something which is missing from the RCTs, because there cannot be any RCT which can look at the problems which are at the system level problems, and that is where, say for example, on corruption, on nepotism, on cronyism, on inequality that arises because of inequality in assets, inequality in balance, imbalances in education infrastructure or access to those issues. Now those are issues on which you cannot design an RCT. The other the problem is that the ethical approach which was talked about, what kind of questions you should be doing it. And I think as a scientific community it is important to put forward as much evidence as possible, as much data as possible, and make that as an important part of the policy making. In that process, a choice has to be made, and that choice is about what kind of evidence and what exactly can be there. And I don't think there is one unique answer to that question. That despite all the advancement, despite all of these things, none of us can at least claim that we know everything or even a part of some things. So anybody who is claiming that their method is the best for poverty alleviation is obviously living in a fool's paradise. That is what I can you can safely say that, and you don't need an RCT to do that. Thank you.
So I will do my presentation also in kind of in two parts. Very briefly on the evidence part, and then I'll go on to RCT. In policy prescription, evidence is required, but evidence is not the only thing, because evidence is, one could say, is important, but evidence is not sufficient. Because even when you have evidence, you have to prioritize different possible implications which come from that evidence. So you have to prioritize. For public policy, merely having an evidence is not sufficient. It is the trade-off between different policy implications, and that has to be decided in the context of what is the purpose of using that evidence. Now coming to RCT, in the context of these points which I have made. The major implication, the major cause behind the rise of RCT is the collapse of public policy. It was especially attractive to the World Bank, because one thing which we often don't recognize, that World Bank and IMF are also interested in poverty reduction. Most critics would say World Bank and IMF are trying to create poverty, they are trying to generate poverty, or their policies lead to structural adjustment and so on and so forth, they lead to poverty. I differ with that view. I think that the World Bank and IMF are also interested in reduction of poverty from their viewpoint, not because they care about the poor, but they have a vision. IMF and World Bank have a vision of strengthening capitalism as an acceptable mode of production, as an acceptable economic system. So IMF policy is not only an economic policy, it's an ideological and political policy. Econometricians have also criticized the RCT approach. I will not go into details of this. This is called the identification problem. Identification problem is that the kind of samples which you use, how do you use those samples? And what is the reliability of those samples? And so that's another dimension. The third, fourth or fifth, is the question of ethical question. There are two aspects of the ethical question. One is these experiments are conducted almost entirely on the poorest people in the third world. So the poorest people of the third world are being used as guinea pigs for these experiments. So this is making use of the poverty of third world country to conduct experiments, which can also be called a colonialism of knowledge. That this this method of collecting data is hugely problematic from this angle. So there are very serious ethical problems in the RCT approach. So I would conclude by saying this, that on one hand, I would welcome an RCT experiment if there is no other alternative available in a certain place. For example, if there is in a small village, there is a worming problem affecting school children, and they come up there and they say that we want to conduct an experiment of giving anti-worming technology, I would say that since nothing else is available, you do it. But what I would question is the generalization of that for a policy that has very, very serious problems. And that is where we have to really question the RCT approach, that it can actually mislead policy and it can actually have more adverse consequences than it can be anticipated in the beginning. Thanks.
This kind of, a kind of leeway one can take when this RCT actually is nothing but newest radical avatar, radical form of logical positivism. Why I'm saying logical positivism? Because, for a long time, the whole social sciences, but driven by this kind of behavioristic streak, and of course, Professor Himanshu, they produced evidence. And that evidence was tabulated, on the principles of science, on the principles of logic, on the principles of mathematics. They try to quantify everything, and if something is not quantified, they won't speak. So whole logical positivism is inbuilt. Last but not the least, where do we go? Is our thinking happening into almost a vacuum, or there's a robust agenda? And that robust agenda is also part of, who is going to be Nobel Laureate and who is not going to be. Enough hints have been already given to us. So what kind of economy, what kind of econometrics we are going to privilege? I think it's nothing but, the same authoritarian attitude which logical positivism has done, and it has a large bearing, whatever social sciences studying we grew. And it was evidence. So this RCT evidence is also almost like a contradictory or oxymoron or carrying forward the same agenda that we need to look at. Ekdam last. We all use languages, isn't that? But are we using the languages of different kinds in a mindful manner, or we are completely swayed by, because somebody is doing a research from MIT, therefore MIT lab? Are these labs are the similar labs which Skinner did to his, as a psychologist, radical behaviorist? And he has almost become, professor in prophecy, that look, the day in science history would come, will determine everything. Is RCT also doing the similar job? I think we need to rethink about these evidences and these methodologies. Otherwise, it's a haywire. So we need serious rethinking about the conceptual and theoretical resources. Thank you so much for that.